Today's deck is a band value deck starring Kellen the Kid, coming in at a wondrous $100. So, what'd it do? This deck is a double dippin' dynamo.
Just take one dip and end it.
No, you dip the way you want to dip, and I'll dip the way I want to dip. Kellan the Kid is a 3/3 flying lifelinker for 3. And whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, you may cast a permanent spell with equal or lesser mana value from your hand for free. Or put a land from your hand onto the board. We're going to be casting spells while we're casting our spells, all the while never running out of things to do. We'll be packing a variety of mechanics to cast our spells any which way but normal, including foretell, adventures, future sight, battles, discover, plot, and even rebound. On top of all of that, we're going to be coming to the board with a toolbox of interaction to solve just about any situation, including counterspells, board wipe, spot removal, board protection, recursion, enchantment, and artifact removal. So, if you like always having the answer and never running out of things to do, this is the deck for you.
It's budget brews live, pal pip, so settle down and take a sip. Essential feeling if you're budget brewing. Your opponent's gonna holler and you'll save yourself some dollars. So come on down and get yourself a steal.
Woo! Let's dive in! Alright, let's kick it off with Sage of the Beyond. 7 mana, 5/5 flyer. Spells you cast from anywhere other than your hand cost 2 less to cast, and you can foretell it for 5. Now we haven't seen the rest of the deck yet, but this is going to enable just about everything else in the deck, which in turn is going to allow us to play more cards per turn and generate a more commanding position. Sapphire Dragon. 7 mana, 5/6 flyer. When it attacks or blocks, you scry 2. And then it has an adventure where, for 3 mana, at instant speed, you counter target non-creature spell. With these adventures, you're going to have to cast the adventure side first if you're going to want to get the value from Kellen off of them. So, you just want to hold this one until you need to counter a non-creature spell, and then in a later turn you're going to pay 7, cast the big old dragon, and be able to cast something else for free. Unfortunately, you won't be able to cast adventures off of the dragon side of this since it's not a permanent, but there are plenty of cards that are options for us. Twin Collie Hunter. 7 mana, 7/7 trample, and then once each turn you may pay 0 rather than paying the mana cost for a creature spell you cast from exile, which will be quite a few cards for us. And then the adventure side says, for 2 mana, exile target creature card from your graveyard until the end of your next turn, you may cast that card. So, another option for a trigger here on Kellen. And just a big old body. One of the problems this deck is going to end up having is that we don't have a ton of great ways to close out the game other than big creatures. So we're going to need to have some with trample or some type of evasion to get that damage through and close out the game. We're going to have a little trouble dealing all the damage at the table to finish people off, but I think if we politic right and position ourselves in a place where we don't look too threatening, we should be able to end up finishing off the game with all the value that we generate and the big bodies that come with it. Realm Cloak Giant, 7 mana, 7/7 vigilance, and then for 5, you can destroy all non-giant creatures. I've included a handful of board wipes in this deck just to protect us in case we fall behind. We have board wipes, we have counterspells, and we have a number of other tools to protect ourselves. But should that not happen, we have these fail-safe panic buttons we can hit to make sure that we can get back into the game. Guardian Naga, 7 mana, 5/6 vigilance. As long as it's your turn, prevent all damage that would be dealt to Guardian Naga. So, some protection on this creature, and it gets to stay on tap to help defend us. And for 3 mana, at instant speed, we can exile target artifact or enchantment. In the intro I mentioned we have a number of tools to deal with artifacts and enchantments and things that your opponents are going to be playing, and this is one of those. I would opt to hold on to this card till I get full value out of it, but sometimes you may just want the creature. Beanstalk Giant, 7 mana. Power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control, and for 3 mana you can search your library for a basic and put it onto the battlefield. In this deck, most all of our ramping is coming in the form of creatures because they're going to be permanents that we can play through Kellen for free, just to ensure we get that value from him if we don't have better options. And this is a great example where you can play it early and play it late. And since we're putting all these lands into play, this thing should be pretty big. Unfortunately, it doesn't have trample, but you can't have everything. Stormkeld Vanguard, 6 mana, 6/7, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. A big evasive creature, we could probably get some damage through with this on whoever has it coming. The adventure side is a 2-mana destroy target artifact or enchantment, so another artifact enchantment removal. Be careful though, this one is at sorcery speed, so make sure you don't get caught with this one, thinking it's an instant. Horned Lock Whale, 6 mana, 6/6 flash ward 2, and it comes into battlefield tapped if it's not your turn. And then on the adventure side, you can bounce a blocking or attacking creature. This is a bit of removal and just a big creature with board. Railway Brawler. This is a new card. It's pretty cool. Love the art on this one. I don't know why, but something about the pose and the rhinoceros is really striking a chord. 5 mana, 5/5 reach trample. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is its power. So basically, it's going to double up the power of any creature you play, and you can plot this one a turn early. Alright, I'm gonna hit pause real quick just to ask you to smash that like and subscribe button. Looking at the data over on my supercomputer, I can see that only 1% of you nerds who watch my videos are subscribed. Now, I'm gonna have to sell my kidneys if I don't get about, 32% of you guys to subscribe to my channel. Alright, back to the video. Magus of the Future, 5 mana. 3 of which is blue, might be a little tricky for us. It's a 2/3, and you play with the top card of your deck revealed. You may pay lands and cast spells from the top of your library. The top of your library is not your hand. Anything you cast off of this dude is going to trigger Kellen. We like to call these effects future sight effects, so we have a number of these type of effects, coming in different forms: creatures, enchantments, I guess just probably creatures and enchantments, and they're going to help us rip through our deck pretty quickly. Tulane, Teller of Tales, 5 mana. 2/4 vigilance. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. Then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. And for 3, you can tap him and return target creature you control to its owner's hand. This card is going to help us ensure that we keep our hand full and we can keep playing cards and going through our deck quickly. Plus, we're playing a couple of cards like Cultivate and Kodama's Reach that help us put extra lands in our hand. Hopefully, we're going to just have enough lands in our hand that we can keep using that as a ramp effect as well. Battle Mammoth, 5 mana, 6/5 trample. Whenever a permanent you control becomes a target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. Foretell 4. So here's another card for us that's going to allow us to draw cards when something happens, and this is just another tool for us to keep gas in the tank. I've included a number of these. If we're going through cards as quickly as I'm playing it, we're going to need these cards to make sure we can keep going and keep the wheels spinning. Vizier of the Menagerie, 4 mana, 3/4. You may look at the top card of your library, you may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast creature spells. Here's another future sight effect that we're going to be able to put to good use. Our deck is mostly creatures, so we should be able to hit this pretty often. Twining Twins, 4 mana, 4/4 flying, vigilance, ward 1. And on the adventure side for 2 mana, you can blink a creature. This is going to help protect some of our creatures or get extra value off of ETB effects. Plus, the body's really nice on this one. Thread Bind Click, 4 mana, 3/3 flyer, not great, but for 3 mana you can destroy target tapped creature. Evasion on a creature and some removal. Rashimi, Eternity's Crafter, 4 mana, 2/3. Whenever you cast your first spell each turn, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card with converted mana cost less than that spell's, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. If you don't cast the revealed card, put it into your hand. This effect is not totally dissimilar from Kellen, so it's nice to have another creature who can do something along the same line. Primeval Herald, 4 mana, 3/1 trample. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you get to ramp a land. Not much to say here other than this is how we plan on ramping our deck and getting into the game quickly. So these cards are very beneficial, and we're going to be able to put them into play free later in the game with Kellen, so they're not stuck in our hand or awkward to cast. Does this face look familiar to anybody? This is Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy, the Kellen from the set before this. He's a 4 mana, 3/4 flying vigilance, and when he attacks you get to destroy up to 1 target artifact. If you controlled it, you draw a card. We don't have many artifacts, so I don't think that's going to be super relevant, other than the ones that we generate from his adventure side, which basically adds up to not paying to crack a clue. So for 2 mana, you get to create a clue and play an extra land. 3/4 flying vigilance for 4 mana is a good body, and he can start destroying some of our opponent's artifacts. Woodland Acolyte, 3 mana, 2/2. When he enters the battlefield, you draw a card. And on the adventure side for 1 green, you get to put target permanent card from your graveyard on top of your library. If someone ends up taking out one of our big creatures or one of our big threats or value engines, we're able to put it back on top of our deck. Plus, we can just play him to draw a card and potentially put something else from our hand into play. Vega the Watcher, 3 mana, 2/2 flyer, and whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, draw a card. Like I said, another card that's going to keep gas in our tank. Outcaster Trailblazer, 3 mana, 4/2, when it enters the battlefield, you add 1 mana of any color, so it refunds you 1 mana. And then whenever another creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you're going to draw a card. More gas in the tank. Fibblefip, Lost on the Range, 3 mana, 1/1, ward 2. I've been looking for a home to put this guy in because it's such a cool card, but it's not great in a lot of other formats. So you're going to look at the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card, you're going to be able to plot that card for its mana cost. You can do this more than once per turn. So any extra mana you may have, you're going to be able to use Fibblefip to put that to good use for a later turn. Put that stuff on layaway. Farhaven Elf, 3 mana, 1/1, when it enters the battlefield, you're going to ramp for a basic land. Pretty straightforward. Augur of Autumn, 3 mana, 2/3. It has Future Sight for lands, and then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you're going to be able to Future Sight for creatures as well. Again, another card that's just going to allow us to churn through our deck pretty quickly. Viridian Emissary, 2 mana, 2/1, and then when it dies, you get to ramp a land. Nice cheap ramp spell. Doesn't always go off as quickly as you'd like it to, but it prevents people from attacking you more than you'd think. The Reality Chip, 2 mana, 0/4, reconfigure creature. So this enters as a creature and then you can attach it to something else for its reconfigure cost, or detach it to make it back into a creature. This is going to give you a Future Sight effect for everything, so lands, spells, whatever. It's a little on the slow side, but it is pretty darn powerful. We want to play enough of these effects that we can rely on them to happen every game, so this might not be the best one, but I think it has a home here. Sakura Tribe Elder, 2 mana, 1/1, and we can sack it at any time, and we're going to ramp a land. Great blocker if we don't need the land right away. Knight of the White Orchid, 2 mana, 2/2 first strike, and if an opponent controls more lands than you get to ramp for a plains card. Only this one doesn't go onto the battlefield tapped. Doesn't that face look familiar? Kellen, Daring Traveler, 2 mana, 2/3, whenever he attacks, you're going to reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature with mana value 3 or less, you get to put it into your hand. Otherwise, you can put it into your graveyard. We're playing 15 other creatures that hit on this ability, which is not too bad. And then on the adventure side, we can pay 1 green and create X map tokens where that is 1 plus the number of opponents who control an artifact. So we could potentially get up to 4 map tokens off of this. Hypnotic Sprite, 2 blue for a 2/1 flying. And then on the adventure side, we're going to be able to counter a spell with mana value 3 or less for 3 mana. I think this is a cool little card and is perfect for this deck. It's not super impactful, but we're going to use every part of this card to help whittle down our opponents. Dust Animus, 2 mana, 2/3 flyer, and if it enters play with 5 or more untapped lands, it's going to get a lifelink counter and 2 1/1 counters, so it'll be a 4/5 flyer. This has a plot cost, so it automatically allows itself to come in. You don't have to play it on 7. A great play pattern with this card is to plot it on 2, and then on turn 5, and then follow through with the rest of the turn like you normally would. Doc Orlok, Grizzled Genius, 2 mana, 2/3. Spells you cast from your graveyard or from exile cost 2 less. And then plotting cards from your hand cost 2 less. This card is going to save us so much mana in this deck. It's going to be beautiful. It's kind of weird. This is a 2/3 bear. You don't see that very often. I guess being a doctor gets you 1 extra toughness? I don't know. Dawn Treader Elk, 2 mana, 2/2, and you can sack this for a green and search your library for a basic and put it into play tap. Another cheap land ramp spell. Invasion of Zendikar, 4 mana, you're going to ramp 2 cards, and this is going to flip over into a 4/4 Vigilance Haste elemental that taps for mana. It's also a land. So the creature side isn't very impactful for us. It is a decent body. But what is really interesting is that when you defeat the battle, you technically cast the spell on the other side, and the spell has mana value equal to the front side, which is 4. So that's going to trigger Kellen. Invasion of Chandalar, 5 mana for a 4 defense battle. When Invasion of Chandalar enters the battlefield, return up to 3 target permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. So here's some great recursion for us later in the game. And then when we flip it over, the body on this one is actually pretty decent. It is an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield for free. So this doesn't interact too well with Kellen, but it is doing more or less the same thing he is. So if we don't have him on the board later in the game, we're going to continue to be able to put stuff onto the battlefield for free. Mind's Dilation, 7 mana enchantment, and probably the coolest card in the deck. Whenever an opponent casts their first spell each turn, that player exiles the top card of their library. If it's a non-land card, you get to cast it for free. Since this deck doesn't have an absolutely clear win condition, it's just going to outvalue our opponents and put stuff on the board and hopefully end up winning, let's just add our opponent's deck into the mix and see if we can win that way. Virtue of Loyalty. 5 mana enchantment at the beginning of your end step, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control, and untap those creatures. This is a form of pseudo-vigilance, and it's going to grow our creatures each turn. And then on the adventure side, we're going to be able to create a 2/2 Knight token. This is one of the more expensive cards in the deck. If you want to cut this, you can save a lot of money on your budget and get this deck in for even cheaper. This does have a decent home here though, since like I said before, we don't have a ton of clear win conditions. We just want to get our creatures out and start slamming people. This is going to make them be able to block and do a little more damage. Omen Path Journey, 4 mana enchantment. When Omen Path Journey enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 5 land cards with different names, then exile. Shuffle your library. At the beginning of your end step, choose a card at random exiled with Omen Path Journey and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So for 4 mana, you're going to ramp 5 lands over 5 turns, including the one you cast this on. Since this is a permanent, we can just put it in play off of one of Kellen's triggers. Set it and forget it. Elven Chorus, 4 mana enchantment. This is a future sight effect, so we're going to be able to look at the top card of our library at any time, and we can cast creature spells from the top of our library. And it's going to turn all of our creatures into little dorks. Case of the Locked Hothouse, 4 mana. This gives us an explore effect every turn, which means we can play an extra land, and if we control 7 or more lands, it shouldn't take too long for us. And then once you control 7 or more lands, we'll solve the case, and it's going to turn into another future sight ability for lands, creatures, and enchantments, which comprise way more than half of the deck. Chameel, the Inner Sun, 6 mana. Spells you control can't be countered, which could end up being pretty nice depending on who we're playing with, which just means we're going to flip cards from the top of our deck until we reveal something that has CMC 5 or less, and we're going to be able to cast it immediately, or put it into our hands if it's not a good time to do that. Again, another expensive card in the deck, so if you decide not to play this card, I wouldn't blame you. You can get the budget of the deck way down if you don't. And if you go click on the Moxfield deck list down in the description, you can see some other cards I'm considering if you want to replace this with something cheaper. Arcane Signet, because Arcane Signet is a very powerful card in Commander, and for the same reason, Soul Ring. Arlen's Epiphany, 7 mana. Create 2 1/1 bird tokens. Alright, for 7 mana. Oh, and take an extra turn. Exile Arlen's Epiphany. Foretell 6. Later in the game, if we have any type of reasonable board state, this card could end up being our win condition pretty easily. Recurring Insight, 6 mana sorcery. Draw cards equal to the number of cards in target opponent's hand, and then this has Rebound, which means at the beginning of our next upkeep, we're going to be able to cast this one again. For free, which will trigger Kellen. Expel the Interlopers, 5 mana sorcery. Choose a number between 0 and 10. Destroy all creatures with power greater than or equal to the chosen number. I mentioned earlier that we're going to be playing some board wipes just in case we fall behind. We have a panic reset button that we can hit. This is just one of those. It's one of the cheaper ones. Feel free to use any of these that you already own. They're more or less interchangeable as long as they're not biting us too hard. Wrath of God. Same reason as Expel the Interlopers. This one's 4 mana, so I think it's a little better. Also, it's the original, so show a little respect. Depopulate. Same thing, this one might allow somebody to draw a card, including us, so it could have some upside if played at the right time. Starnheim, Unleashed, 4 mana, create a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying and vigilance. So you're going to create a Sarah Angel here, and then if this spell is foretold, you create X of those tokens instead. Or you can decide to play it on curve if you're falling behind. Search for Tomorrow, 3 mana. Search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Doesn't come into play tapped, which is pretty cool. And you can suspend this for 2. So you could play this before Kellen comes out, play Kellen, have this come into play, and then get a trigger from Kellen. Mrs. Pilgrimage, 3 mana, sorcery, search your library for up to 2 basic forest cards, reveal those cards, and put them onto the battlefield tapped and the rest into your hand. Then shuffle your library. And then Spell Mastery. If there are 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard, search your library for up to 3 basic forests instead of 2. I don't know how often we're going to be triggering that, since we're not playing a ton of instants and sorceries, but it could happen. And 3 mana for 2 is not a bad deal either. Kodama's Reach, 3 mana. You're going to put 1 basic land into the battlefield and 1 into your hand. I like these cards with Kellen because if you don't trigger Kellen to put a permanent into play, you have the option of putting that extra land you grabbed into play. Cultivate. Essentially the same exact card as Kodama's Reach, but it's not an arcane sorcery, which we have no way of taking advantage of anyway. Rampant Growth. 2 mana, sorcery, the original ramp card. You're going to look through your deck and put a basic land card into the battlefield tap. Cosmic Intervention. 4 mana. If a permanent you control will be put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, exile instead. Return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So this is basically going to blink all of our creatures that might die to a Wrath, and you can foretell it to make sure you get it for pretty cheap. This is just the first of our protection spells. I'm going to go through the other ones now. These are good to have in these type of decks where we're planning on winning with creature damage. We're going to be playing 3 of these effects. You could opt to play another one if you'd like, but you'll see why I'm not in a second as well. Your Temple is under attack. 3 mana instant, another protection effect. This one's going to give indestructible, or if you're in a pinch, you and target opponent each draw 2 cards. I've never cast it for that side of things, generally because I include enough card draw in my decks, but if you need it, it's there. Make a Stand. 3 mana, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain indestructible. I like this card because you can choose to use it to finish somebody off as well if you need to, but generally that's not what you're doing. Saw It Coming. 3 mana, instant, counter target spell, and you can foretell this. So this card is a counterspell, and it's also going to allow us to trigger Kellen. As I mentioned before, the reason I'm not including more creature protections is because I feel like we have enough counterspells in here to stop the cards that are going to really be a problem for us, like board wipes or removal. There are a lot of instances where you would rather the board wipe hit everybody else and not us, so that's why we have the option for the protection spells. Counterspell. In case we'd like to counter a spell. Arcane Denial. 2 mana, counter target spell, and then you're going to draw a card at the beginning of the next upkeep, and the person whose spell you countered is going to draw 2. This is a nice, cheap counter spell, and doesn't require 2 blue, which is pretty important sometimes, especially in the early game. 3 Steps Ahead. This is one of those newfangled spree cards. If you've seen these before, I'm going to explain how they work. I'm sorry, I apologize in advance. So for a blue, that's the absolute baseline you have to pay, and then you basically have an a la carte menu of what else you would like to do with this spell. For another blue and a colorless, you can counter a spell. For 3 colorless, you can create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control, and for 2 mana, you can draw 2 cards, then discard a card. The cool thing about these spells is it's like a build your own card. You can use up to as many of these as you'd like, as long as it's at least one of them. Most of the time, this is just going to be a counterspell at cancel cost, but later in the game, you can get a ton more value out of it. Or if you need the 3rd effect to dig for a card, you can just do that too. That's it for all of these spells in the deck. I'm going to go through the lands. I'm going to go through them a bit quicker. It's not that important which lands you use, other than having about the same mix of color symbols that I'm using. I opt to use cheaper dual lands most of the time, just to keep the budget down. Use whatever you have. I prefer fast lands, just to make sure that we can do things early in the game. You might not have that preference. Play whatever you like. I'm going to quickly go over the ones that have interesting effects other than mana abilities, and then I'll just kind of list off the mana abilities. Alchemist's Refuge. This can tap for colorless, or for a blue and a green. You may cast spells this turn as though they had flash. If we have a ton of mana, later in the game we can threaten casting everything at instant speed, and really make the other players make the first move, allowing us to react to them. Hidden Cataract. We're going to be playing all 3 of these Discover lands. They're not all that great in most other decks, but I think they could have a home here in case we ever run out of gas. What they allow you to do is they come into play tap, they tap for a single color mana, then if you pay 5 and sacrifice it, you get to discover 4. Discovering is going to trigger Kellan's ability, so we can get a little more value out of these lands than we normally would. Hidden Courtyard and Hidden Nursery are the other 2 colors of these cards. Mystic Sanctuary. This is going to tap for blue mana, and then it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more islands, which might be a little difficult for us. It's not a slam dunk. But when it enters the battlefield untapped, you may put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. We are playing some pretty impactful instants and sorcery, so being able to recurse some of those may really get us back into the game. Like a board wipe, or something that's going to draw us a bunch of cards. Command Tower, because you play Command Tower in every Commander deck. It is the best land in Commander. I'm gonna just rattle off some of the lands here that I'm gonna be playing. Like I said earlier, feel free to use whatever you have as long as you have the right mix of symbols. Botanical Garden, Canopy Vista, Glacial Fortress, Hinterland Harbor, Irrigated Farmland. I'm including the cycling lands here. I just think they add a little more utility than most of the other cards. If we have too many lands later in the game, we can pitch this and get something else. Overflowing Basin, Prairie Stream, Scattered Groves, Sky Cloud Expanse, Sungrass Prairie, Sun Petal Grove, Temple of Enlightenment, Temple of Mystery, Temple of Plenty, and Seaside Citadel. A nice cheap tri-land. If you have the expensive one, play that instead, or play both. So, that's it for the deck. I know this deck doesn't have a real clear win condition, but I love these type of value decks where you get to just play a bunch of cards each turn and you're making tons of decisions with tons of interaction. I think if you're smart, and I know you are, you can figure out how to win with this deck at most tables that are playing roughly the same power level you are. So what do you think? Do you like it? Am I an idiot? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.